Chapter 4. When I first met the women in 1972, more than 2 years after the crime, there was a vague incongruity. The Special Security Unit, by whatever name, still felt like death row, even though the prisoners had been reprieved. I enjoyed the women from the start. I became friends with them as weeks and months passed. But I was bewildered at their nonchalant acceptance of their imprisonment. In the beginning, the women didn't speak of the murders, but the murders were the reason we were all together in that cage. When I started working with the women at SSU, the rule of their being allowed out of their cells, only one at a time, was relaxed. One of the empty cells became our schoolroom. I arrived twice a week, laden with books and academic exercises, to which they were always responsive. Every session lasted 3 to 5 hours, everyone contributing to discussions of the readings. They all had quick minds, and they had plenty of time to study every day, so they invariably met deadlines and produced good work. During breaks, we drank grape tang and shared personal memories. They liked to hear about my children. They wanted to know about the main area of the prison and what was going on with the women, then 600, out there. Every day I spent in the main prison produced some new revelation about the workings of power and resistance in a closed environment, some of it, thankfully, comical. I shared my amazement at the resourcefulness of so many women crammed together, denied almost all basic amenities, such as tampons. One of the male prison administrators told me in earnest that he thought the women might be tempted to use the packaging as dildos. I confided my heartbreak at watching an elderly friend from the main prison, who had every reason to expect parole, stagger out of the boardroom after her hearing, slump to the floor, and break into gut-wrenching wails. I told them about the night that a woman played a guitar in the hallway, a few minutes past curfew, and how a guard punished her by hauling her off to rack, solitary confinement. They were all empathetic. Leslie, who at the time had not had a parole hearing, but who, in the years ahead, would go through many such denials, said, "I'd have felt just as you did. That terrible helplessness when you know there isn't anything you can do." And I told them how inspired I was by some of the characters I encountered in my day-to-day work over there. Mostly prisoners, but staff as well. People whose positive energy encountered the negative environment. One such individual I told them about was the psychologist in the main prison, who was near retirement. She had a quirky, compassionate personality and wonderful stories about her immigrant heritage. I loved learning that, in 1900, it was her Uncle Theodore who published Sister Carrie, a great novel depicting the kind of urban street life that still opens doors into prison. The women often talked about their problems with the male psychiatrist who saw each of them regularly, or as often as met his fancy. They described his sexy, gleaming, bald head, the way his glasses glistened in the sunlight, and his attachment to his huge, glittering diamond ring. They stared at it while he questioned them. His method was to challenge them in a loud voice, trying to provoke them to express anger, trying to get them to yell back at him. The more excited he got, the more he would agitatedly twist his ring back and forth on his finger. But they responded in their calm, undefensive way, not liking it that he was after them to reveal the monster inside. His sessions seemed to be reinforcing their loyalty to Manson. From their stories and others I'd heard, I didn't think he sounded entirely competent. My opinion was reinforced a few years later when I heard him at an investigative state senate hearing on his practices reiterate the age-old patriarchal perception that females have more mental problems than males. Eventually, however, he was helpful to the women in certain aspects, especially Leslie. The vast majority of the prisoners who sought psychiatric counseling were given medication, with no personal attention at all. To him, medication was therapy for all but a select few. He expressed his pride in how attentive he was in responding to women's requests for pills. You cannot find a person in here who said that they were actually mentally ill, that I didn't see, and put on pills. To me, his attitude seemed counterproductive to a therapeutic environment. He was committed to the custodial management of potentially unruly, caged human beings, whom he generalized as sociopathic. Leslie, Pat, and Susan were spared his condescension and his assembly line pill treatment because he thought they had something he had wanted: the keys to the mysteries of what had turned them into monsters. For this reason, they were given what few others were granted: individual therapy sessions. Eventually, his approach did help Leslie to get focused, and he made a significant difference in her transition away from Manson. The family, BC. For at least 6 months from the time I first met Leslie, Susan, and Pat, the main topic of informal conversations was the family BC, before the crimes. They had many happy memories of the harmony they had experienced with Manson in the beginning. They expressed nostalgia for the days when, out on Spawn Ranch, the decaying but then still active Western movie set on the desert near Los Angeles, they had enjoyed a communal life with one another, isolated from mainstream society. The family had been made up of beautiful people, a collective perception enhanced by Manson's frequent dispensation of the 60s route to awareness, LSD. Since Manson was a prolific songwriter, everything they experienced with him became a song. The women knew all his songs, and within our schoolroom cell they often sang them in sweet harmony. To them, life was beautiful. This included scavenging for food by rescuing still edible cast-out bread, cheese, canned goods, fruits, and vegetables from grocery store dumpsters and writing a song about it. Market basket A&P. I don't care if the box boy stares at me. I don't even care who wins the war. I'll be in them cans behind my favorite store. If you're living on the road and you think you're starving, get off of that, my friend. Just get in them cans and start carving. Oh, garbage dump, my garbage dump. That sums it up in one big lump. We are the garbage pickers of America. The song sounds macabre, given the events that followed their garbage frolics. At the time, their approach to gathering edible food was tribal, it was harmless fun, and it was ecologically prescient. They recycled and cut down on waste. The women had fond memories of how, between periods of malnourishment, they had prepared sumptuous meals from the garbage they collected. As in many communes all over the land, Manson's family milked the warmth of mutual kindness through every sun-kissed day in their Southern California hideaways. They talked about how, for a while, their family seemed ideal to them. When Susan gave birth to her baby, not fathered by Manson, everyone gathered to celebrate the cosmic miracle. The women cared for the children collectively. At one point there were 4 infants, one of whom, I surmise, was sired by Manson. During those early months, the women all described him as having evoked feelings of pure love. They said he had a calm, saintly demeanor during the gentler days. Being brainwashed. When arrested in 1969, Manson was booked by police as Manson Charles M., aka Jesus Christ, God. Usually he didn't directly introduce himself as Jesus, but he made blatant implications in his speech and in his gestures, which everyone in the group heard and saw together in the same way. If he was Jesus Christ reincarnated, as he sometimes seemed to be, how could his followers deny him anything? The women's descriptions of their feelings towards Manson when they first met him resemble the testimony of other ex-cult members. An ex-member of the Hare Krishna cult described how temple leaders talked in soft voices, always lightly smiling mysteriously, and how hypnotizing it was. The ex-Hare Krishna said, "I completely forgot about everything. I got the feeling I couldn't leave, like there was no way I could get out. I don't know what that was. I had the feeling that it was God calling me, and that the whole outside world had sort of vaporized." Similarly, an ex-follower of Jim Jones, leader of the 1970s People's Temple cult, described her experience of losing her will. You voluntarily choose not to question. You voluntarily choose to allow someone else to make your decisions. Then you kind of turned off this logical portion of your mind which people use to make everyday decisions. You stopped using it. And eventually you lost the capability of making decisions. Leslie describes how she felt in the early 1970s, when she became aware that her thoughts weren't her own. When I'd be questioned and not have any answers, I'd go blank and become frustrated, like when a machine jams and just sits there making noise. In my head, nothing was functioning. I was trying to understand, breaking down stiff little slogans that had been drilled into me. Leslie's experience, and that of Manson's other young women, bear similarities to the experiences of women suffering from battered woman syndrome. Their spouses abuse them, but they are brainwashed by the batterers to blame themselves. They lose, or have never had, their personal agency, and without intervention they won't leave, even if they know they can. Descriptions of the women attached to Manson also resemble those of newly born-again Christians, or anyone in the first blush of having been converted to a doctrine that purports to have all the answers and relies on faith. Bugliosi described Sandra Good and Lynette Fromme, who were the first Manson associates he met, as follows. I was immediately struck by their expressions. They seemed to radiate inner contentment. They smiled almost continuously, no matter what was said. For them, all the questions had been answered. There was no need to search anymore, because they had found the truth. And their truth was, Charlie is love. When Bugliosi met other women involved with Manson, he observed, same expressions, same patterned responses, same tone of voice, same lack of distinct personality. Their answers were as if rehearsed. Often, they gave identical responses. Bugliosi's impressions were not unlike my own when I first met the women in 1972. Of Manson, he says, he was not only capable of committing murder himself, he also possessed the incredible power to command others to kill for him. And yet, Bugliosi professed to believe that the women were sufficiently self-directed and sane to be prosecuted for first-degree murder. On the flip side of the happy commune story, which turns Manson's utopia messiah hype on its head, is that he exercised overt and covert control over everyone in his fluctuating family. He was served by the young women in all domestic matters, sending them out hunting and gathering, using them to lure businessmen, bikers, drug dealers, pretty young men, and the 81-year-old landlord, George Spawn, into his fold. At Manson's discretion, the women who served him by day might be expected to sleep with the visitors by night, as gifts from him. In the ancient tradition of men who held property in common, Manson was the head man deciding how, when, for what purposes, and by whom the property would be used. The men who came to Manson appreciated his generosity with the women. He was not at all like the Freudian father who keeps the women for himself, which is why the sons have to kill him. He charmed the women into feeling important in his presence, even though he was pimping them and treating them as dispensable. As Pat recalled in a 1994 interview with Diane Sawyer, sex was a means of control. When he had different men that he was trying to initiate into the family, he would offer them whatever woman he had. Leslie adds, "When a man wanted you, you went with him. You couldn't resist." Sawyer also interviewed Manson and interjected clips from that interview in her edited tape of the interview with Pat and Leslie. She confronts him with the women's charge of sexually exploiting them. He replies, "Isn't that what women do? Isn't that what women's for? Women receive men and reflect men. Man holds dominion up over women. It's been that way since," he grunts, "since we grunted and we came out of caves." Given what he did to so many young women, it is appropriate that he later lived many years of his life in the Vacaville Maximum Security Medical Facility, which primarily houses sex offenders. He was also housed in Folsom and in San Quentin, where, in the 1970s, the adjoining cell was occupied for several days by Timothy Leary, the ex-Harvard guru of psychedelics who told youth to turn on, tune in, drop out. Manson once told his tribe that Leary was the father of them all. But in San Quentin, he treated Leary paternalistically. Leary was convinced that the authorities had put him next to Manson as a provocation, a test, a game. Leary said, "He was talking to me all the time, giving me advice on what to do or where I made mistakes." Having been abandoned as a child and perpetually incarcerated by the state most of his life, Manson could read and prey on people's weaknesses. The young women were affected by the intense accuracy with which he perceived their feelings of estrangement from their former lives. He loudly disparaged the consumptive, punitive, bigoted, competitive, greedy values dominating his country. With the same fierce passion, he idolized nature, creativity, music, children, sex, and the freedom to make choices, everything that prison denied him. When he saw an injustice against an underdog, it made him furious. But he didn't recognize or acknowledge his own abuses of women and young people. He had lived much of 30 or so years in segregation jails or with other convicted boys and men. When on the streets for short periods, he had been a pimp, among other street occupations. He had a short-term marriage, during much of which he was incarcerated, and another brief relationship, and incidental encounters while on parole. But for the most part, he could only fantasize about women. They were rarely part of his day-to-day adult world in any significant way, until March 21st, 1967, when, newly paroled, he discovered the age of Aquarius. Paroled into the era of the hippie movement, he found young, free-spirited women, attracted to his outlaw ways, mindlessly responding to his fantasies of what they should be as women, sex goddesses and domestic slaves. Margaret Singer, who has interviewed thousands of former cult members, defines a cult as a group with a charismatic leader who is worshipped by followers who subjects them to coercive manipulation. She considers the process of recruitment to be an essential feature of cults. Certainly, many of the young people who joined up with Manson were recruited by those already attached to him. But my sense is that, in the beginning, he wasn't seeking disciples. The girls he approached virtually gave themselves to him. Later, young men lured vulnerable girls into Manson's fold. New devotees, women and men, brought in yet more candidates for their growing family. This was an age of rapidly proliferating pseudo-gurus. A few people who associated with the family did not worship Manson. They were men and they dropped away before the violence began. Like any wannabe dude, Manson appeared to want other men to respect him for his toughness. Also, for his sense of manhood, he wanted the attentions of beautiful, young, compliant women who would take care of him in every way. This included helping him get even with his adversaries. On his own in the mainstream world, in the absence of the girl's adulation and that of attractive young men, he would have seemed an unlikely candidate for the position of guru. But they willingly gave him their power. He took their trust, and he used it against them. One can readily surmise that Manson's own power as a human being to think, choose, and act rationally had been cruelly destroyed by a retributive justice system. Whether or not brainwashing the middle-class young white girls who came to him was his conscious intent, it was misplaced vengeance. Payback justice. Manson acted out payback justice, whereby if one white man oppressed him, he could kill any other white man and his woman as revenge. He saw anyone with any privilege as fair game, since all were representative of a power system that kept him from his life and didn't appreciate his brilliance. With the murders, he acted from a primitive impulse to destroy the enemy, the rich piggies, rather than from a coherent class or race analysis. The prison experience generally teaches about death, not life, which is why prisoners who resist and who remain or become life-affirming and energized are so remarkable. I believe that if Manson had internalized the power of positive thinking, he would have been positively remarkable instead of frighteningly pathetic. Another aspect of payback justice is that it knows no statute of limitations. The time never runs out when it is legitimate to gain revenge against those who have oppressed us and/or our ancestors. We can live with these obsessions all our lives and for generations. Manson gained new justification for revenge with each insult he had to endure as a less-than-favored prisoner for most of his life. He exulted in the infamy that came with the 2 publicized nights of murder. He apparently felt no sorrow for his victims or their survivors, including dangerously mystifying mishmash karma talk about life and death flowing together. I recall that in a televised review hearing in the mid-1990s, he was mockingly acting as if, or perhaps revealing that, he didn't know the names of the people who had been killed at his instruction. He continues 3 decades later to behave as if he feels nothing for them, or the victims, or his cleanup murders. Acts of predatory violence are often, as with my son's theory of delayed self-defense, expressions of a need to defend one's self that was thwarted at the time of one's own victimization. Frantz Fanon, a revolutionary North African psychiatrist, vividly described Algerian men's compelling need to physically fight against their French oppressors so that they could directly express justified anger and regain their manly dignity. Richard Wright powerfully illustrated those principles with his fictional renderings of African American men's rage. For all his peace and love talk, Manson couldn't absolve his dominant need for violent revenge for all the wrongs that had been done to him as a vulnerable child and lifelong prisoner. He was still trying to find a way to defend himself, especially with women. Pimp that he was, he sent Tex and the women into the field to mow down the enemy, while he, the general, conducted the war from headquarters. With his tribe of disciples, Manson got a taste for power. He had a ready audience of his songs, ramblings, and riddles. For example, if you're looking, you'll never find. Don't try to keep up or you'll be left behind. Over time, his devotees became prepared to live for him, to die for him, and if the cosmic forces required it of them, to kill for him, trusting that it would be for the good of humanity, just as any good soldier must trust. Manson wrote in a song, "Thou shalt not kill," said my daddy. Mother agreed, as she served a meat patty. The Indian said, "Kill only what you need," but the white man likes to see things bleed. Look at the big man passing to others his fear. Look to the children. Judgment Day is near. Charles Mills Manson had been shifted from one home to another soon after his birth in Cincinnati to a 16-year-old on November 12, 1934. He got his last name from a short-lived stepfather before the parents ran off separately to break the law in various ways. By 1967, he had been incarcerated much of his life, and virtually in every kind of institution. As a young kid, he'd already done time in several other reformatories before. As a pre-adolescent, he escaped from Boys Town in Nebraska after a few days. Later, at age 15, he pulled a supermarket robbery with an escapee chum. Charlie graduated to more secure jails for youth and, soon, to hardcore prisons for adult male felons. Prison, by definition, is abusive. He learned about fear, how to control his own and exploit others'. For example, while on parole, he was walking with a friend and both of them were carrying drugs. They recognized a narc up ahead, and Manson's friend wanted to run the other way. Manson, however, approached the man and made small talk until the narc brushed him off. He advised his friend, "Don't let him put any of his fear in you." During pre-1967 parole breaks from adult prisons, he formed at least 2 serious, if short-lived, relationships with women, including one marriage, both of which produced a child, but apparently he had no ongoing family ties. He worked as a burglar, car thief, forger, and pimp. He achieved his popularity with the youth and the late 1960s surge of rock and roll to which he was fanatically devoted. His followers disregarded the adage of the era, coined during Berkeley's 1964 free speech movement, "Don't trust anybody over 30." Ultimately, his dogma was an inventory of the flaws of the society that rejected him and infantilized him as a prisoner without choice or responsibility. As a leader, he exhibited a frenzied hunger for control. As a kid, he had been excluded and locked up. As a prisoner in 1985, he said with wistful sadness, I've lived in your tomb, wishing I could go to high school and to proms. When Manson selected a specific residence for the first night of murders, he was not operating at random. Apparently, he did not know that the house was leased to Roman Polanski. Whether that is true is not crucial, because Manson did know that the house had formerly been the home of rock producer Terry Melcher, but who had aroused Manson's ire by not turning him into an overnight success. Manson and Tex Watson had both been to the house on several occasions. According to one journalist, the murders were justified by Manson owing to his failure to find a market for his songs, and he projects what he saw in Manson's media images at the time of the murders. If they won't hear me through the music, let them feel me through violent deeds. Taking power. Manson targeted his followers' emotional vulnerabilities to both exalt and demolish them. He became a tyrant because so many people, especially beautiful young women, were willing to do his bidding. Into the ears of impressionable idealists, he articulated the hypocrisies of the establishment with eloquence of street poetry, and he offered a vision of a counterculture that was irresistible to those in his inner circle. He initiated them into open sexual practices, playing on their physical insecurities. His furious insights brought to him a devoted, if small, band of followers. Over time, about 25 girls and young women from age 13 to early 20s, and 10 young men. In his inner circle were 3 men and 10 women, most in their late teens and early 20s. At the time of the crimes in 1969, when Leslie was still 19, Manson was approaching age 35. He had kept his family in isolation, in their own little world, which is how cult leaders operate. They didn't read newspapers. They didn't have clocks. To them, there was no time. He effectively separated his young followers from their families and the world. He gave them new names and they gave up their birthdays, starting life anew. He acted from a sense of biblical destiny, but he tore away at the conventional, religious, white, middle-class values with which most of his followers were raised. He raged at what he wrongly presumed to be his own parents' moral hypocrisies. He extended his judgment to all middle-class people who enjoyed their comforts at the expense of the world's depleting natural resources. His followers' task was to lose themselves, to eliminate their pasts, to become as one with the Son of Man. He used endless repetition of platitudes to indoctrinate them, to take on his will, as his followers expressed it. As an older man with street smarts, Manson played on the fears and uncertainties of young people trying to find their way in the world, independent of their families. It was a time of dynamic social change when many people were questioning traditional values, yet he offered himself as a surrogate patriarch. Under his protective wing, they would change society. Jean Gallick, my co-teacher in SSU and the women's friend, described the family as the shadow and logical extension of the nuclear family. Like the old patriarchs, he demanded obedience from every member of his family, but unlike most fathers, he used drugs, music, role-playing, and sex as tools of manipulation. He intimidated those under his spell, determined to kill their egos by telling them they were stupid or were missing some personal quality necessary to enlightenment, which made them even more submissive in their efforts to gain his approval. Leslie came to him as an extroverted young woman, but the eventual effect of Manson's beratings was that she crawled into a shell when she was around him. Although part of his inner circle, Leslie was never in Manson's inner circle. She would lapse into thinking for herself, which made her a less than perfect devotee. This problem took on profound significance when, at the murders of the LaBiancas, she was unable to follow orders. Some element of conscience was at work on her mind, breaking against will through the layers of prophecy and apocalyptic images inscribed on her brain by the Son of Man. He saw the apocalypse happening, as did they. The 1960s California droughts, floods, fires, and earthquakes, shootings in the streets, and poisons in the air. None of them challenged Manson's view that 1969 was the time for the world to undergo a major rupture and change, the ultimate revolution, which would empower African Americans. Several years after the crimes, in 1972, with 5 or 6 of us in a circle on the floor of our tiny schoolroom cell, with the guards watching from the doorway, Susan, Pat, and Leslie sang Manson's songs a cappella with clear, harmonious voices. When the sunlight streamed into the cell through the small barred window, it would strike against Pat's hair, gleaming gold and red. This laughing woman who wrote poetry and music and played her guitar. Susan, also very musical, was always intensely focused when engaged in conversation. Leslie was sensitive to any movement by the guards or sounds of birds outside, the wind in the trees, approaching sirens, alert to any change in the environment. Leslie and Pat did most of the bantering. All 3 expressed very similar attitudes and opinions based on their guru's reasoning. It wasn't until each fully separated from Manson that I recognized them as truly distinct individuals. While still beholden to Manson, and with pleasure in the remembering, they ingenuously, non-judgmentally, cited examples of how he had manipulated their thinking. He gave everyone LSD systematically and frequently. For weeks in a rented house in an LA suburb, when they were all under the effects of large doses of the hallucinogen, he played and replayed the Beatles' White Album, demanding their full attention to the lyrics. He made inferences concerning the song, Revolution 9, and ranted to his hypnotized disciples about the Bible's book of Revelation and the apocalyptic race war that was inevitable, that needed to be started in order to shift power from the white man to the black man. He claimed with outsiders that it was other people who saw Jesus in him, but to his followers he posed himself as Christ on the cross. He later wrote a song about the power of music that said, "How did you think I could talk to you, except through the music? How else did you think I could stop the confusion in your mind?" It is sadly ironic that Beatle John Lennon, Manson's hero, was later assassinated by a rabid fan who envied Lennon's fame and who, as a counterpoint to Lennon's pacifist music, like Manson, could imagine having power only through use of a deadly weapon. Manson, the racist and misogynistic guru. Manson had never accepted the idea that he was a cult leader, and I am persuaded he never systematically planned to be one. But his exploitation of young people looking for answers, especially charming, pliable, feminine young women with wanderlust, and his gradual accumulation of purposeful and incidental controls over them, resulted in a classic cult group with Manson as the singular patriarch. Others, like Bobby Beausoleil, had their own charisma and followings of young women. A guitarist, Bobby sometimes jammed with Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, which gave him status with young people. Manson favored Bobby and expected Leslie in particular to serve Bobby's needs. But within Manson's circle, it was on Manson's head that the light shone. It was his wisdom that inspired his followers and guided their actions. His word was the first and last word, and although he assigned specific women to the men who came to him, he didn't intend that these couples would form a commitment to one another. As explained by Charles Tex Watson in his discussion of group sex at the ranch, as long as we loved any one person more than the others, we weren't truly dead, and the family wasn't one. Watson goes on to marvel at how all the girls clearly preferred Manson to any of the other men who joined up with him, even though, apparently, he was not a particularly skillful lover. Charlie did not provide the ultimate in the physical side of sex. The attraction must have been psychological and emotional, and perhaps even spiritual. Although he was himself completely devoted to Manson and served as his henchman in the murders, Watson was mystified by Manson's ability to control so many beautiful women, given Manson's negative attitudes toward the female sex. As Watson described Manson's views and practices, women were the primary source of ego programming. Thus, no mother in the family was allowed to take care of her own child, and the women were always supposed to talk to the babies in nonsense syllables to avoid contaminating them. Women built the prisons. Women caused the wars. Women upset the natural order by refusing to keep their intended place, slaves to men. Charlie seemed to have a special hatred for women as mothers, even though he taught that childbearing was one of their major purposes in life. According to Charles Watson, Manson was also aggressively racist and insisted that blacks were less evolved than whites and therefore only fit to be their slaves. Nevertheless, Manson believed that now all the centuries of oppression and exploitation for Blackie were over. His karma had turned, and it was time for him to rise and to win. In Manson's convoluted theory, if rich white people were killed in their homes, the crime would be blamed on poor black people, which would start the race war that was Manson's self-styled Armageddon, which he called Helter Skelter. White people would assume that blacks were embarking on revenge for the centuries of damage done by whites. The whites, in response, would seek out and punish blacks for the murders. The blacks would retaliate, and they would be the underdogs who survived, arose, and conquered their oppressors. During the race war, the family would live safely in a hole in the desert, an underground paradise on the edge of Death Valley, until the turbulence settled. They would live in this bottomless pit for years, and because of their transcendent power, they would never age. Forever the beautiful people with the energy of youth. In Manson's fantasy, they would save people from burning cities, especially the children. When the troubles were over and they returned to the Earth's surface to stay, the black people would welcome them as allies in the task of reorganizing the planet. Charles Manson's divinity would be recognized. The gender factor. It's common for people who have been involved in murder to report that they felt as if they were watching themselves, as if they were out of their own bodies. The effect of LSD is likewise an out-of-body experience, and a vivid short-term memory of the LSD trip, a flashback, causes a person to recall that non-physical state. On the perceptual level, not all the women were in their bodies at the times of the murders. From their perspectives, as instructed by Manson, their own as well as other people's bodies were insignificant to life, an obstacle to perfect understanding. Freed from the body as an obstacle to flight, under the illusion that the body has been transcended, the spirit becomes one with the universe, to the point of infinity, When the time has come for the countdown to the gas chamber, the Manson women had been ready to depart their bodies for a long time. So taken they were with Manson's truths. Gender, age, race, and class all loom large in the Manson scenario. He attracted both women and men, but women were much more numerous among his followers, and it was not a coincidence that it was primarily women whom he chose to do his killings. Some of the men, such as Tex Watson, who had a strong Christian background, but who experienced his devotion to Manson as a religious conversion, were as submissive to him as the girls were. Generally, the men who came to him seemed to identify with his outlaw persona, even when their own backgrounds were conventionally middle class. Most obviously, his power over men seemed related to his ability to attract women, and his generosity with the women's bodies, offering the girls to whoever wanted them for a night, was certainly a draw. He presented himself as a mystic, and he was convincing to men and women alike. But clearly the women were his trophies, symbolic of his masculine power. They gave him status with other men, including those seeking spiritual enlightenment. Of the many young women and men who came, some stayed a short while, others permanently. Many of the girls who came were below the age of consent. The 14-year-old daughter of a Methodist minister, Ruth Morehouse, came to visit and later returned, convinced like the others that Manson was the reincarnated Jesus Christ. The girl's father came to retrieve her, but he was himself converted, and for a time remained there under Manson's spell, one of the few older people in his tribe. Manson sexually exploited young women with their tacit permission because they believed in his authority. Each of them, all white girls, had been successfully socialized to be attractive to men, soft and feminine in appearance and demeanor, and they honored men's hierarchical privilege and the social order. They excelled in submissiveness. He used their dependency to coerce them to stay, if that was his desire. He excluded doubters. He attracted teenagers and young adults from every background, but especially from the middle class. When he'd used up someone's trust fund, he'd send them packing if they were not otherwise attractive or useful to him. His selection of victims was reflective of straightforward class antagonism against materialist consumer piggies, and his plan to start a race war was patronizingly racist. He controlled group gatherings, flattering or intimidating individuals, and one-on-one encounters. He demanded exclusive loyalty from those closest to him, and he was not always kind. As Leslie says, "It was an honor to be that close to a chosen person of God, but he made me feel stupid, and it was clear by his behavior that I had a lot of giving up to do, to be worthy of my position and closeness to him." My impression is that any of his female disciples would have gotten involved in the murders if he had asked them, as verified by Ruth Morehouse, a former follower who testified in Leslie's second trial. She described how they were true believers and sexually passive, which suited Manson's purposes. He had favorites, whom he protected, in a manner of speaking. In his inimitable style of leadership, he decided who would stay home and who would go to war. It was a privilege to be chosen. It was speculated that Lynette Fromey did not intend to kill President Ford in 1975, that she staged the attempt to impress Charles Manson, whom she hadn't seen for the 6 years he'd been back in prison, to make up for having been excluded from the helter-skelter of 1969. From the women's cheerful recollections of their life on the edge with Manson, it seemed to me that his madness was unequivocal, but his brainwashed family, certainly the 7 women I met, had been actively receptive to his revolutionary intentions. Manson could seem saintly, his eyes glowing with cosmic insight, and he could be demonically cruel, his cruelty interpreted as teaching them yet another important lesson. He obscenely berated the young women who came to him and treated them as disposable when not treating them as desirable, a classic double bind. Because, as he told them, everyone is perfect as they are, he didn't permit anyone to wear eyeglasses. He broke at least one woman's glasses to make a point. He violently struck at least one woman on more than one occasion to discipline her. As they obediently strove to be who Manson wanted them to be, they lost themselves in his energy, absolving themselves of personal responsibility or agency. One by one, they gave him their power, the power to build them up and to knock them down. He was writing the script, and they were playing their parts in his fantastical world that Manson was inventing for them. The Santa Cruz University tutors, who worked with Pat, Susan, and Leslie over the course of several years, came to know the women well. They marveled at how such bright, rational women could have ever been attached to the twists of logic that had come from Manson. They thought it remarkable that the courts had found the girls to be sane. According to the judgment, the girls not only did the deed, they did it with conscious, deliberate intent. Certainly, Manson and his tribe weren't the only people to believe in the inevitability of a race war in the USA. Manson was ridiculed in the press as a dangerous fool, but the Ku Klux Klan, the Aryan Brotherhood, and other white supremacist organizations, which draw men and their families from every social status, have also predicted, for over 100 years, that a race war is coming, and continue to do everything they can to accelerate its arrival. Spawn Ranch has been mythologized as a sinister place by definition. Yet, until the paranoia and violence surfaced, the Manson family appears to have been, in many ways, a haven for good kids needing a safe place. In an interview, Manson said of Leslie, clearly wanting her trust, "I ain't never lied to her. She knows it. I've never told her a lie. None of those kids." He talked about his family as a soul movement. This person had no place to stay, and this person was lost and had no place to stay, and I didn't have no place to stay. They were nobody, and I was nobody. Only in retrospect is it easy to recognize the pathological level of Manson's push to power over the young women, and men as well, and their eager acquiescence. In a 1969 interview with her lawyer Marvin Part, following her arrest but prior to the first trial, Leslie expressed Manson's hybrid spiritualism. The trial is preordained. Everything that happens is perfect. Sounds far out, but it's true. Sometimes I doubt it and get shaky. I hope I could walk out. I want to be free, but I'm not afraid to die. I think I'm an angel, not with wings, but I believe I am one of the disciples. I can't talk the reality of it, but I can feel it. At the time, Leslie may have been alone among the disciples in her fleeting acknowledgement of sometimes suffering doubt. All of the girls who came to Manson were well prepared to serve him. Before they ever met Manson, they had already accrued years of practical training in the arts of femininity and service. They all had healthy figures and faces and personalities to attract a wide voice of partners. To superficially stereotype Leslie, Pat, and Susan as I saw them on the surface, some months after we first met, I would write. Leslie is the classic beauty, poised, elegant, well-spoken, and vivacious. Pat is the girl next door beauty, natural, healthy, cheerful. Susan is the exotic beauty, soulful, sensual, a risk taker. All three, and the other Manson girls as well, had been successful as girls before they met Manson. Pretty victims of over-socialization to feminine gender scripts. Pat, Leslie, and Susan are all skilled in the domestic arts, including needlework. They, like all his women, were talented in all the skills that go into the making of a beautiful home and taking care of a man's needs. The most conspicuous quality the women shared with one another in abundance was that they all aimed to please, which Manson exploited. To that end, they maintained positive frames of mind and agreeable attitudes no matter what transpired in their lives. I was impressed that none of the women ever spoke against the prosecutor, Vincent Bugliosi, or his then assistant, Stephen Kay, who had mythicized them as monsters with his book, TV, movie, and speaking tours. They took a long view of things. They were initially distressed at Bugliosi's sensational and frequently false portrayals of them, but emerged undismayed because they had faith that, in the end, karma would balance everything out. Facing the truth. To separate from Manson, the women would have to separate from every reason they were in prison. They would have to admit to an unspeakably huge mistake, a grievous error committed utterly in vain, shameful beyond expression, destructive to its core. There is no language that doesn't somehow trivialize the somber enormity of the murders and what it has been for their own, and especially the victims' families, and for themselves. Had they been executed as expected, they would have gone back to dust with their beliefs intact. As they saw it for the first several years of their incarceration, if they hadn't been caught, they would have triggered the race war that guaranteed justice to black people. Early in our association, I sensed that they were consoled with the belief that they were right for having at least tried. With the enemy of unrelenting time in which to face their memories, to run them and rerun them again and again in their minds, to be forced into reflection, to be faced by those who love the sinner and hate the sin, each of the women had to live, year after year, through a terrifying awakening, from believing that Manson was a god and that they'd done the right thing, to recognizing the profound wrongness of their actions, and therefore the emptiness of Manson's authority and the magnitude of their guilt. Their acceptance of their crime was finally transformed into immense regret as their perspectives on life gradually normalized. With more teachers and other visitors coming to their unit over the years, they met a wide range of people who challenged different facets of Manson's beliefs and methods. The violence was de facto condemned. Some of their tutors were feminists who challenged their obeisance to a male guru. Another was an African-American scholar who protested the racist flaws in Manson's thinking about race wars. In the absence of Manson's authoritarian voice, each woman in her own time and way, under influences of her own choosing to a certain extent, and independent of everyone, began to reveal ambivalence. After a few years, when they had drifted even from one another, they were united in the rejection of Manson's omniscient power over them. Their rational minds and consciences came to the fore, which brought grief to them and relief to others. The media were extraordinarily aggressive in the Manson case. Early on, Susan's first lawyer wrote a book over a weekend, based on his initial interview with her. It was inappropriately published before the first trial started and contained her false confession. Only much later did it come to light that she was, at that time, taking responsibility for crimes she didn't commit. Some speculated that she told fictions to cellmates, correspondents, lawyers, and jury because she was subconsciously eager to be convicted, to do penance. The book threatened the trial even before Susan had testified before the grand jury. After months in jail, away from Charlie, she had agreed to testify because, in exchange, she was promised a life sentence instead of the death penalty. She was as truthful as she knew how to be in her testimony before the grand jury. In the trial, however, she was in Manson's presence and once again under his spell. No longer afraid of the gas chamber, she repudiated her grand jury testimony. Again, she attempted to exonerate Manson with false boasts. Her grand jury testimony was voided, and nothing would save her, or Pat, or Leslie, from a death sentence. In the trial, Susan claimed to be the one to have killed Sharon Tate and her almost born child, and to have felt a mystical connection to her victims. In fact, as he later confessed, though he had gone along with Susan's story in his trial, it was Charles Tex Watson who killed Tate, and all the others. I was the one who stabbed that beautiful blonde pregnant actress. Stabbed her again and again, over and over. Stabbed her because Charlie told me to. Susan had also claimed to have been involved in both nights of murder, even though she was not present for the La Bianca killings. To my knowledge, Susan was the only one of the women who had a police record prior to meeting Manson, and as a young rebel she enjoyed being a fledgling outlaw. As a teenager, she'd lost her mother to cancer. She'd been a Girl Scout and had sung with the church choir, but she'd also shoplifted as a kid, worked as a topless dancer, and done some teenage robbing and car thievery for which she had served brief jail time. Not until she met Manson was she in touch with murder. First at Gary Hinman's, and then at the Tate House. She was perceived by other followers as most wanting to be seen as the female Manson, his mirror, a desire many of them shared. Susan had abandoned her Manson devotee posture entirely by the time, in the late 1970s, that she was transferred to the main prison, where she became an active member of the church. For years, she had been clear that she did not, in fact, engage in killing rituals of the kind she described in her testimony. The lore notwithstanding, not one of the women was successful as a killer. In every case, Charles Watson, the clean-cut college kid from Texas, had come to their aid in brutally ending others' lives. Despite their commitment to Manson, they were incompetent and apparently terrified at the scenes of the crimes, as any good girl would have been in such a situation. Doing school. In the presence of outsiders who came to see them when they were still on the old death row, none of the three women was ever disrespectful toward another. Their harmonious rapport was in some ways a facade, built on their mutual adherence to Manson, now a tenuous link because he really was not there anymore. While with Manson, the three women and others had, in effect, been a harem, lumped together as his girls. After some time in prison, they were no longer the Manson girls, but three very different young women, each coming to terms with her own distinct self and circumstances, apart from their shared experiences, guilt, and interminable incarceration. At the same time, they were mutually interdependent on one another for the company of humans who could truly understand the situation. The congenial SSU staff was not opposed to our having fun during our school time and visits, and music was often a focal point. Singing, playing tapes, talking about music. They rang a great close harmony trio rendition of Crying Time, and a rousing version of Big Red Balloon, written by Jean, their friend and prison mate when they first arrived. Occasionally, performers came in to give them private concerts, standing in the passage in front of the solitary cells with open bars. Singer-songwriters, starting with Chris Williamson, Holly Near, and Country Joe McDonald, came in and sang their hearts out. Judy Grahn, a poet of consequence, also inspired and energized them, as did others. These experiences had deep effects on the women, as did their lively encounters with tutors, such as Paul Krasner, a humorist and author of note with a fascination for the ways that certain historical events are linked. Prior to his work in the prison, he had spent time as a journalist in the company of Lynette Fromme, Sandra Good, and other women involved with Manson, talking about conspiracy theories. Men like Country Joe, Paul, and others did workshops in the Special Security Unit. Bill Barlow did one on the history of the blues, Bill Moore on African American history, Rory White on art history, and Michael Rotkin on politics. Other dynamic, non-sexist men introduced the women to relevant new information, literature, music, and political perspectives, introducing them at the same time to new kinds of men. The women who tutored were likewise progressive. Catherine Cusick, Deborah Miller, Jean Gallick, and Nancy Stoller were program co-coordinators and instructors who arranged workshops in psychology, philosophy, literature, and medical sociology. Candace Falk gave a workshop in economics, Tanya Neiman in law, Cheryl Anderson in midwifery. Pat and Susan and Leslie absorbed new ways of thinking of women's lives in broadened contexts. The young women in SSU also had the benefit of some enlightened staff, including the young guard John Ellis. One day at the women's request, while we drank our cold grape tang, he stood in the doorway to our schoolroom, and in his lush, grand tenor voice sang Ebb Tide. There wasn't a dry eye in the cell. The women reported that some days the guards would arrive at their unit in the morning singing or whistling, not typical prison guard behavior. Most of their guards, men and women, black, brown, and white, young and old, enjoyed their work. It was part of their job to chat with the women about ordinary experience, to help keep them alert to the world beyond their reach, to keep them attuned to the realities of ordinary working-class lives. It was thought that regular interaction would help the women gain and retain their sanity, which proved true. The women knew details of their guards' marriages and kids, their money problems, what they did on vacation. Everyone knew about one another's lives. When it was just the two of us teaching in SSU, Jean and I sought ways to make the hours in school both memorable within and during breaks from academic work. On one hot day when no one could concentrate on the text, we spent an hour looking through a book of art by Escher. They thought it was spooky and depressing. I expressed surprise that, after what they'd been through, this merely weird art, flat on the page despite illusions otherwise, would repel them or affect them negatively. But they didn't like anything that struck them as strange. This led to a discussion that revealed some of the psychological complications of their crimes, their denial and detachment at that early stage from the violence itself. None of them seemed to have any taste for bloodshed at all. It was as if they hadn't been there. They could look at it only in metaphorical and metaphysical terms, as the dance of life and death. After the women had talked a while about how they viewed the crimes, the guard in the doorway asked me nervously, with pointed intent, "Now, are you teaching them, or are they teaching you?" He didn't want them talking about the crimes, certainly not in such eerily detached, mystical ways. I appreciated their talk because I wanted to understand it. I wondered for a time if they had actually been involved in the murders at all, if the whole thing was someone else's doing, and the women were sacrificing themselves as martyrs to their faith in Charles Manson. In effect, that is what happened. Even though they were physically present and tried very hard to be good soldiers. Our casual conversations were often banal. We talked, for example, about cows, whose nearby presence was ever known from the ever-present noxious odor in the still, hot air. This led to talk about why prisons are so isolated from other human communities. The lock 'em up, but not in my backyard syndrome. With the 1980s to 1990s growth of the prison industrial complex and privatization of some new prisons, many cities are now putting out the welcome mat. Like most people, Leslie and the others believed in prisons that there had to be some place for people who are known to be dangerous. They knew themselves not to be dangerous, but they never expressed the feeling that they shouldn't be in prison. With equanimity, they accepted the extraordinary restrictions under which they had to live indefinitely. When we first met, we talked about the ambiguity of their legal status, now that the death penalty was lifted. They didn't know if they'd be returned to court for resentencing or automatically commuted to life in prison, with the eventual possibility of parole. The latter is what occurred. Doing prison positively. In a typical day without visitors, the women passed the 23 hours in their cells by reading, doing needlework, meditating, thinking, writing, cleaning their 6 by 9 spaces, talking with one another, listening to the radio, trading gossip with the guards, and trying to sleep. They longed for diverse human company. As time went on, every 6 months or so, they were escorted from their unit to the dentist office in the medical building. This was an important event because it was the only time they got to visit the main prison. Their escorted walks across the prison grounds brought them into fleeting touch with the larger prison society from which they were segregated. Unless they were lucky enough to have a guard who would relax the rules, they couldn't touch hands or communicate verbally with other prisoners who passed by. But they could signal recognition to women they had met in the LA jail during their trial. They would make eye contact with other women. They could expand their view of the world in which they were incarcerated. With guard escorts willing to look the other way, they took chances by communicating with women who passed by, with quick whisperings or the brush of fingertips, passing overtures of friendship. From their cells, after dark, Leslie, Pat, and Susan could see through the bars on their windows, beyond the fences that contained their unit, across the yard, through the barred windows of the psychiatric treatment unit. They gossiped about the PTU women as if they knew them. There was the woman they called the Roadrunner, who furiously paced up and down the hallway every night, and Bald Lady, who always wore a white towel wrapped around her head. On hot nights, when the lights were out but the barrel windows were open, they would fall into silence and listen to the PTU voices wafting across the yard. They would match voices with women they'd named from a distance through the windows at night and would refer to them in friendly terms as if they were pals. By day, they liked to watch out the window for the women from the main prison who were assigned to yard duty near the special security unit. They looked as if they were having a good time riding around on the mower tractor. To Pat, Leslie, and Susan, the grounds outside their windows looked like the free world. Within a year, 2 yard women in succession were caught trying to communicate with the girls while mowing nearby. As penalty, each was fired from her coveted job and sent to rack. Like most prisoners, SSU women quickly learned to accept the punitive exigencies of prison life. In my observation, it takes a spiritually evolved or highly self-disciplined person to survive even 1 year in prison with a positive attitude. In contrast to the frequently negative ambience of the prison at large, Pat, Leslie, and Susan were consistently enthusiastic about life. They were committed vegetarians who obtained permission for a while to order health food through the mail. They grew their own vegetables from mail-order seeds and the strip of stone-clotted dirt that was their yard. When permitted, one at a time for an hour, they would sit in the sun in the narrow passage between their brick hut and the high chain-linked double fences and encourage their plants to grow while reading, doing yoga or needlework or dreaming, all under the omnipresent eyes of the guards. Within the main prison were many guards who were antagonistic towards the more than 600 prisoners, and with the authority of the state to back them, they often used cruel methods to control the women. But in the Special Security Unit, with only a few very compliant women to watch over, and having been selected for their post, in part for their more humane and mature approach to maintaining order, their guards, as I observed them, were almost invariably kind human beings. The normal problems of prison culture simply didn't exist in their small and very separate space. Sometimes the women would have gifts for the outsiders, often creative ones: music, art, or embroidery. One of my favorite gifts was an exquisite dried leaf from Leslie, which I used as a bookmark. It had blown into their yard. Sometimes the outsiders would bring treats, such as the time on Leslie's birthday, when, having asked her what she most missed from the free world, she laughingly said, as she often did, a banana split. This was an in-joke. One day during a visit long before, in addition to the usual grape tang, the women had served pastries and Swiss cheese, which, given normal prison diet, was amazing. "Where did you get this food?" I had asked, and they rolled their eyes toward the staff office. I had then asked them, as I always did, if they needed anything, meaning medical or dental attention or envelopes or sweater, and they all cried out in unison, "A banana split!" Wishing for a banana split in prison is akin to wishing to win the lottery. But on this day, unbeknownst to Leslie or the other women or the guards, when our time was up and Jean and I had said our usual goodbyes, we drove immediately to town, 20 miles or so down the road. We got all the ingredients and put the ice cream and Cool Whip on ice in a cooler. It worked just so-so on the long, hot drive back to the prison in heavy traffic. We worried. It was against the rules for us to be taking food into the Special Security Unit. It was also against the rules for us to go or return to the unit without an authorization slip. The authorities who could give permission would be gone for the day, and ice cream would soon be melting. Yet, when we got back, every guard at every stop let us through quickly when we told them and showed them what we were doing. All were amazed and some were amused at our chutzpah. These men did not normally go out of their way to accommodate prisoners, or outsiders who sought to ease the strain of incarceration. To the contrary. But the attitude toward the women in SSU seemed to be that, given the extraordinary restrictions on their lives, and given their reputations as being unfailingly cheerful and cooperative, it seemed okay to bend the rules in this case. Certainly, banana splits weren't a threat to prison security. The SSU guards knew from relayed reports what we were up to by the time we arrived back at their door. They let us in quietly with conspiratorial grins on their faces. They did not announce us to the women. They agreed that, if they haggled over rules, the ice cream would melt. One guard was particularly helpful. He was an older man with grandchildren, and he said very earnestly that they were good girls, and he was happy to bend the rules for them. The guards helped us slice bananas in half lengthwise and put 2 halves in each brightly colored plastic boat dish. Then we added 3 scoops of ice cream, vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry, topped with chocolate, caramel, strawberry, and pineapple sauces. Finally, we topped it with coconut, chopped nuts, whipped cream, and maraschino cherries. Banana splits for everyone. Because Leslie had just turned 22, her banana split held a perfectly lit candle. The party got even better when several other staff unexpectedly arrived with found object gifts to wish her a happy birthday. Word had gone out through the checkpoint guards. The gathering was festive, very high energy, partly from all the sugar, and Leslie, Pat, and Susan were ecstatic. We all were. We gorged on the banana splits and felt cheerfully ill afterward. I said that I hadn't eaten one since I was a teenager, when I had worked at 2 soda jerk jobs. One at an ice cream and hamburger joint, and the other in the drugstore, in our railroad town in the Montana Badlands. I'd forgotten how good they were. The guards agreed. For months after that, whenever I'd asked what anybody needed or wanted, banana splits would still be the reply, and we would all laugh. It was their code for every seemingly unfulfillable but irrepressible dream. On that day, I was wearing a green crystal prism necklace that was given to me by a friend in Eritrea, East Africa, where I'd worked with the Peace Corps and where my 4th child was born. I gave it to Leslie, and she cherished the rainbows it brought to her cell when she hung it over her small, barred window, and the way it extended her space. It brought color and motion to a drab, still enclosure. She wore it around her neck intermittently for years. Later, in a box from home, she received another crystal for her window. Like anything sent in or out, including letters, it had to first pass the scrutiny of the prison censors. While she waited for them to give it to her, she wrote a serio-comic plea to the censors to hurry, explaining what a prism can do to someone imprisoned. Yes, I said prism in prison. Prying through my present from home, you persist on being persnickety. I suppose that's your prerogative. After all, that's your position, dear censor. But in perspective, prisms in prison are permissible, no more impractical than pomegranates in Pittsburgh. Hanging amid the steel bars on my cell window for an hour each day, the dingy walls dance and spin with city lights. Red, yellow, green, blue, purple, orange, vivid, rare rainbows reminding me never to forget my pot of gold. Perhaps I'm presumptuous in thinking you would appreciate the small crystal's permeations. Don't prick me with your procedures. Please, permit my prism to free me from this prison. The 3 women, all artistically talented, were generous gift givers. For example, Susan had hand-sewed an elaborate burgundy velvet riding coat with lavish embroidery for her friend and teacher, Jackie, using fabric remnants supplied by the prison occupational therapist. I was the recipient of beautifully strung beads, books of value to them, notably Be Here Now by Baba Ram Das, embroidered garments, and the complete collection of Charles Manson's song lyrics. The lyrics were neatly typed with whimsical colored pencil illustrations by Leslie. They were bound in an exquisite black, burgundy, pink, and white cover, cleverly handmade from cardboard, covered with scraps of velvet, taffeta, satin, and lace. My unease at possessing anything so intimately connected to Manson was overcome by the women's pleasure in my response to their handiwork. Leslie and Pat's final project as Manson girls in the early 1970s was a large, stunning embroidered dragon, a layered multi-dimensional riot of bold colors and form in motion, minute stitches of thread and human hair, woven into a deeply textured, frighteningly charismatic creature, signifying Manson himself. When they passed the dragon to an outside friend, it was a way of parting once and for all with the guru, although loyalties did not dissolve so cleanly, clearly, wholly, or simultaneously. In the mid to late 1970s, starting with Leslie, the women were transferred one by one to the psychiatric unit for a brief period, and then to the secure main prison cottages, where they had many other women to interact with and relatively more choices for how to occupy their time. Finally, each of the women was able to embark on her own path, entering this transition to the real world of the prison after many years in isolation. One of the important reasons they enjoyed our school while they were still in the special security unit was that it got them out of their cells and into their schoolroom cell. Just that much movement, maybe 15 steps, expanded their horizons. The physical restriction had the inevitable effect of restricting their knowledge of the world. As an other prisoner friend once said, "In prison, you forget the art of the possible." Conversely, some women can learn a sustained patience, unfathomable to the frantic pace of most lives in the free world, and often difficult for visitors to comprehend when they witness the stressful conditions of prison. Leslie, in particular, had demonstrated an ability to remain still within herself, to wait and watch, to avoid conflict or confrontation, to be always ready to be useful without trying to make it happen every moment. The Buddhist influence is pronounced in her practice of patience. An important part of Leslie's grounding was the loyalty of her mother, Jane, who visited her daughter in jail or prison almost every week for almost 3 decades. In 1998, Jane's health began deteriorating. Now in her 80s, she has since needed to limit her visits. I met Leslie's mother when she arrived at the Special Security Unit one day in 1972 for a visit with her daughter. She was then in her early 50s. She was and still is beautiful, then prematurely white-haired, with a young face, strong posture. She exuded warmth. I learned that she'd been studying Spanish in preparation for a trip to Mexico. When Leslie introduced us, I wanted to say, "You must be so proud of your daughter," because I knew Leslie as a talented young woman and a good student, and the staff clearly respected her. I didn't, but as I observed them greet each other, I saw Leslie's mother's respect. Jane was family, the real thing. Permanent, stable, and full of heart, no matter what. And she didn't need anyone to tell her all the reasons she could be proud of her daughter. Leslie's father has also been unconditionally loyal to Leslie, and none of her siblings abandoned her. In 1977, speaking of her parents' unconditional love and loyalty, Leslie voiced concern that they worried that somehow I ended up here because of something they did or didn't do. None of it is their fault. More about Susan. For years, Susan and I exchanged only occasional holiday greetings and messages via our mutual friend, Rory. Since the mid-1990s, we've been corresponding again, and I'm on the mailing list for her ministry newsletter, in which she gives witness to her faith and describes changes in the prison environment and problems the women are suffering. It was clear to me from the outset that black-haired, sparkling brown-eyed, olive-skinned Susan Atkins, age 20 at the time of the crimes, had served Manson with unconditional devotion. Linda Kasabian, who was with Tex, Pat, and Susan at the Tate murders, testified that the experience was unreal. She couldn't believe it was happening at the time, and couldn't believe afterward that it had happened. Linda stated that, before anyone was killed, she had begged Susan to make it stop, perhaps perceiving her to have that power. But Susan said, "No, I can't. It's too late. I've lost my mind." As Susan later put it, "I was brainwashed into believing that death was an illusion. I was deceived. Charlie was deceived. Everyone involved with the whole thing was deceived into believing that what we were doing was right. Everything I said was so bizarre." For all her bravado, and although Manson and the media gave her a wild reputation by linking her to the Beatles song Sexy Sadie, I found her to be a sensitive, mystical woman on a spiritual quest. She had a transparent need to be connected with others. I could imagine her as a wild woman as well, but she tried to please everyone, and she was very pleasing indeed. Susan reveals a quality of fierce strength behind her gentle demeanor. Susan's friend Rory sculpted a dramatic bust of her as he saw her. Young, beautiful, with a strong and noble face that, in the sculpture, is staring in fascination at her own outstretched hand, which is an eagle's claw. Rory was depicting how she discovered in herself the power for terrible destruction and was in awe of it. Yet over the years, as the truth came out about the murders, it seemed that Susan had much less talent for destruction than she wanted us to believe, when she was still seeking Manson's approval. In the early 1970s, Susan, as a prison journalist, conducted an interview with me, which was published in the Clarion, the prison newspaper. She was asking about alternatives to prisons, which I advocated. She pointedly wanted to know what I would do with perpetrators of violence. I conceded that incarceration of some form was essential for those who could be reasonably assumed to be dangerous to specific individuals or to the public at large. She didn't seem to disagree, but she also didn't identify herself as dangerous. She could have told me that she wasn't guilty of the crimes for which she had been sentenced to death, but she didn't say that. And she didn't react when I implicitly held her up as an exception to all those other women prisoners, the vast majority, who in my view would be suitable for community-based alternatives to prison. At the time, I believed she had committed the crimes of which she was convicted. In 1977, Susan published an engaging autobiography detailing her experience with Manson, her conversion to Christianity, and her prison experience, Child of Satan, Child of God, with proceeds going to support programs for reformed street girls in New Orleans. In this book, she described her experience of the university tutorials we brought in, and especially women's studies, which gave her incentive to examine the male oppression I had so willingly walked into in my middle teen years and had violently sealed in my relationships with Charlie and others in the family. For the first time, I got a view of my sexual degradation, for example. I began to glimpse how I had allowed myself to be domineered in the most primitive fashion by other people. In my drive for freedom, I had entered into the worst bondage possible. Susan went her own way until, in her transition away from Manson, she found deliverance in Jesus in 1974. She began telling me in letters and visits that she was praying for me. I was impatient with her desire for me to get saved, and we drifted in different directions. At the time, I was concerned that she still wasn't thinking for herself. Her beatific expression as a new Christian was not easily distinguished from the beatific expressions all the girls wore while still devoted to Manson. But decades later, Susan remains a loving, devoting Christian. It's my impression that Susan made a smooth transition to the main prison, where she developed the art of instrument making, wrote religious songs, and ministered to other women through her music. In 1990, she married a man described to me by mutual friends as a good man and a very regular guy. They met through her religious community, and he has become a lawyer since they met. Susan has become in every way a good woman, cloistered within the stone sanctuary of the prison. She is watched over by her husband from the outside and all those who welcome her ministry from behind the walls. About Pat. Patricia Krenwinkel, age 21 when she was arrested, was, in some important ways, Manson's most valued soldier. Her parents had divorced when she was 17, but before that, like Leslie, Pat had had an apparently all-American upbringing in Southern California. Like Susan and Leslie, Pat had sung in the church choir, and as a girl she had belonged to Bluebirds, Campfire Girls, Job's Daughters, and even the Audubon Society. She liked animals, she received good grades, and was, as her father described her in court, an exceedingly normal child. Typically, it was normal, idealistic young people, often high achievers, who joined the counterculture. After one semester of college in Alabama, she dropped out and returned to California to join the 1960s search for enlightenment. She met Manson 5 months following his parole in 1967. He was visiting at the home of her half-sister, who, like so many, had extended hospitality to the stranger. Pat came upon him playing his guitar and felt instantly drawn to him. As he had already done with Mary and Lynette, Manson gave Pat the gift of seeing herself in a wholly new and positive light, and for that she was deeply devoted to him. Also with Charles Manson, she had experienced her first meaningful sexual intimacy. With Manson, she felt beautiful. Like so many of the girls, as soon as she met him, she went off with him. She deserted her car in a parking lot to get on the bus with him. She left her job, her last paycheck, her possessions, her family, her identity. The third of the many young girls who would make similar ruptures. Her father was convinced she was hypnotized. Pat impressed me as having both a girl-next-door youthful wholesomeness and a worldly, wise toughness. Manson was infatuated with Pat, who was readily persuaded of Manson's godlike powers because he was key to her newfound self-identity. Pat had been perceived by co-defendants as brave, though inefficient, in helping to start Helter Skelter, the revolution. She did briefly waver in her belief in the correctness of Manson's strategy, as she said to Leslie when she returned home to the Spawn Ranch, following the murders at the Tate residence. The people seemed very young, and it didn't seem right. She was very upset, but her loyalty was unbroken. Pat continued for several years to keep Manson's photo in her cell. Even after she relinquished her attachment and began reforming her worldview and sense of self, his image seemed to remind her not of her crimes, but of her strengths. With time, taking incremental steps, Pat did look far beyond Manson and confronted what she'd done. In the main prison, she enrolled in university courses in earnest, earned a BA, made herself useful to others, and got a new lease on life. For decades now, that new life has not included Manson. From the posture of post-middle age and the benefit of hindsight, she sees clearly the ways he negatively, fatally manipulated her own and everyone else's feelings and actions. Her letters to me are those of a poetic, active, smart, nature-conscious, good-hearted woman who suffers the anguished burden of interminable guilt. Like Leslie, she has worked very hard to be of service to the women with whom she is confined, and she is active in numerous organizations. She coordinates the taping of books for the visually impaired. Until recently, Pat had little contact with her mother, who lived far away and was ill for many years. Now in her 80s, Pat's mother recently returned to California, and she and Pat enjoy regular visits. Through the years, Pat has remained close with her father, who worked nearby as an insurance agent. He made regular visits to see his daughter and did what he could to ease her situation. Soon after I began teaching in SSU, the prison officials agreed that we could conduct our tutorials in a bare, unoccupied cell 6 feet by 9. Pat's father arranged for the concrete cell floor to be covered with padding and a carpet. To go with the new shag rug, which was a burnt sand color, the women made pillows with color-coordinated slipcovers. Now we could all comfortably sit cross-legged in a circle on the floor, with all our books and supplies filling the small circle of space at our center. Reunions and separations. In the second year of our work in SSU, Pat, Leslie, and Susan acquired 2 new prison mates, Catherine Gypsy Scher and Mary Bruner. Mary had earlier been charged in the Hinman murder, but was given immunity in exchange for her testimony. This time she and Gypsy had been convicted of attempted robbery of a gun store, part of a foiled plan to help Manson escape from prison. The robbery failed and no one was injured. The 2 women were placed in CIW's SSU with the others because of their shared association with Manson and a presumed need for extraordinary security. When Gypsy and Mary joined our little school group, casual conversations returned to Charles Manson, who had been at the center of their shared universe. They now viewed him with radically different degrees of reverence or rejection, but the reunion within the prison had resonance for their memories of times at the ranch on the desert when no one doubted. They had felt themselves among the chosen few and had kissed Manson's fate. He had taught them to be prepared to die long before they were instructed to kill. Now they just sang his songs, all 5 harmonizing on melancholy ballads and upbeat tunes. One particularly catchy yet mournful melody with lyrical poignance, given their circumstances, was, "Your home is where you're happy." Your home is where you're happy. It's not where you're not free. Your home is where you can be what you are, 'cause you were just born to be. Psychiatrists like to use expressions folie à deux, folie à ménage, or folie à famille to identify what's happening when two or more people share the same mad, crazy delusions, or when someone adopts or participates in another's delusion. At Leslie's second trial, psychologists debated as to whether the Manson family suffered from this group madness. All 5 of these women, and many others over a few years, had been taken in by Manson, believing themselves to be among the chosen few. Without realizing it in time to prevent disaster, they had entered into the darkest realms of their own souls when they gave themselves to him. But when I would look at them within the circle on the floor in our classroom cell, on the surface I saw a sorority scene. 5 attractive, intelligent young women, loving and kind, conscientiously tending to their homework, sharing a bond that will forever exclude anyone unable to understand Manson's appeal. I watched their selective retrieval of only the most positive memories, and their celebration of those joyful times before the crimes. I was glad that they could feel, even momentarily, at home with each other within their cold, dreary, sterile prison. But I also knew, as they did, that as individuals they were quietly disintegrating as believers, and, therefore, as a family. Life at Spawn Ranch was tainted now, irrevocably. Their past together would be forever the enemy of their present and future lives. Spawn Ranch itself had burned to the ground in an early 1970s fire caused by a major windstorm, an event everyone noted was laden with symbolism. Leslie, Susan, and Pat were each moving away from a life and a set of beliefs and associations that had provided the highest and lowest moments of their lives. As Leslie began separating from Manson and the others in the early 1970s, so did she begin to punish herself with severe anorexia. At the time, there was little understanding of this disease. It had not yet been widely recognized as an illness suffered primarily by young women who are over-socialized to be unrealistically thin, or who, as a consequence of abuse, are trying to disappear. Many fashion models, in particular, looked like starving casualties of war. But this was the standard of femininity to which girls aspired, and still do, to the detriment of their health. In Leslie's case, it did not seem that she was striving to be attractive. It appeared that she wanted to fade away, as a self-punishment, rather than have to live with the trauma that came with confronting her guilt. Within a few years, when she began to heal and was eating again, she engaged in meditation. Leslie's aspirations had never been materialistic, and by the early 1980s, she had grown into a spiritually mature person. Her positive spirit had suffered setbacks after parole hearings that have seemed to be designed more to humiliate her than to decide on her suitability for parole. But always she has retrieved herself and gratefully discovered, step by step, that her mind and spirit haven't forever been destroyed by her cult experience. Gypsy and Mary were released on parole from CIW within a few years of their arrival. Whereas Gypsy was extroverted and vivacious, Mary, who was tall, fair, and quietly attractive, was shy and reflective. She made a sharp break for Manson. She wrote to me, just before her release, of her fantasy of playing a flute again. I was living in Los Angeles at the time, where a helpful radio disc jockey played on air for a donation of a flute for a woman coming out of prison. Within a day, one was delivered to me. When she was released, Mary came to visit me in Echo Park and to pick up her flute. She held it in her hands, studied it, walked around my apartment with it, tears running down her face, and finally started to play. We spent the afternoon playing flute and piano duets. She found a place far away where she could start her life over, working, raising her son, and playing her flute. Last I heard, she had advanced her education, and she and her son were doing well. Gypsy's first years of parole were more eventful, involving continued identification with Manson, clandestine activity, and a husband in prison. Many years later, I saw her on television as a member of a religious choir. She was still strikingly beautiful, her thick black hair no longer cascading, but still glistening, her dark eyes flashing. I learned that she eventually settled down, is now using her musical talent to sing gospel music, and has recovered herself and transferred her faith to the Lord. Yet another of Manson's ex-followers, after Susan Atkins and Charles Tex Watson, to be converted to evangelical Christianity, where their capacity for unquestioning faith found a home. With Gypsy's and Mary's departures on parole, and Leslie's, Pat's, and Susan's transfers to the main prison, all in the mid to late 1970s, the era of the Manson girls had come to a close. For the three who remained incarcerated in the California prison, memories of bygone days were rapidly superseded by the imperatives of building a life within the prison. A quality of recovered innocence is still very evident in Leslie, now an older woman. It is not the innocence of naivete or youth, although she appears 10 years younger than her age of 50 plus. It's the innocence of someone who has lived, is aware of the baser side of the human species, is compassionate towards suffering, but who has herself never intentionally caused harm. It's a quality of open fundamental fairness that appears at first gaze to be uncomplicated by regrets. Leslie's face also sometimes shows, however, an expression of deep sorrow. The intimate knowledge of the worst harm one can commit. Convergences of innocence and sorrow surfaced in her face and in her voice, each informing the other. With Anne near, I reflected on the ways Leslie made bad choices as a kid, as so many of us do, though with lesser consequences. The culpability we share as adults relates more generally to our complicity in harmful actions by the state. We collude with our silence. Carleen Faith. Her life was incredibly corrupted by the poison, by the deed, by the place in which she found herself, and to which she literally took herself. We all have a choice as to whether or how we participate in the evil in the world, if we recognize it for what it is. We have the right to resist the evil perpetrated by authorities in the guise of goodness and superiority. Everything in America has to be the best. When you travel abroad, the best of America has been imported there. The USA is the best, but it's an illusion, a very big one. One might call this illusion, indulgently, patriotism, until one recognizes that the illusion has a negative side. We are equally sure that we could never do those things we all agree are evil. We could never find ourselves in the position of the German people, doing what they did to an integral part of their own population, and to other peoples in Europe. No. And we certainly do not believe that our Central Intelligence Agency is teaching the techniques of torture and surveillance to certain inimical forces in other countries. KF. Even though the evidence is out, published all the time, in the name of the citizenry, in our name, A lot of terrible things are done. Most of us, most of the time, are not recognizing our choices, our rights of refusal to participate. We choose to not know, to not confront our share in the evil by virtue of our silences. Most of us, most of the time, abdicate our right to choose and resist. We give away our right to choose before realizing or becoming informed about choices, and eventually, periodically, we have to struggle to reclaim that right. As a teenager, Leslie made a conscious decision to go on the road. She and her boyfriend had broken up. She completed legal secretarial school. She was ready for a new life, a good life, a life with choices that didn't promise social stability or material security, but something more meaningful. In the course of her travel, she made the decision to abdicate the choice of a middle-class life of the kind to which her parents had aspired and had achieved. She abdicated the ability to choose, as it seemed to me in 1981, when she had already served about 12 years. KF. She gave it away, her brain, her life, and didn't catch herself in time to avert the killings. She let it go as if she had no idea what her mind was worth, how valuable it was. Leslie gave it away, and that was her first sin. Needing herself so much and knowing so little of what she was giving away. And that is the sin that we all, Anne, participated. And yet heinous deeds in which we all participate don't have the same sort of presence as Leslie's crime. KF. Yes. Her burden is so defined, whereas most inflicted harms are more ambiguous and unseen. The things of which we're guilty, by commission or omission, are so ambiguous we don't always have a name for them. We don't often describe our transgressions to one another, or engage in self-criticism, or shaming ceremonies before our communities. In Western cultures, if we're ashamed, we put it out of sight. Anne. And society has no vested interest in exposing all the shameful deeds of major shares of the citizenry. KF. Because the deeds are so common and so much a product of what we have been taught to do. There was no perceptible reason why Leslie, in particular, should have gotten involved with murder. No simple reason, unless we fall back on deterministic bad seed theories, which still wouldn't account for the anomaly factor. It was her one and only serious offense against law or society. The crime was utterly out of character for Leslie and the others. There was no predicting that her involvement with Manson and his friends would include destroying lives. Risks of the kind they took, roaming, hitchhiking, dropping acid, having sex, moving in with virtual strangers, finding soulmates out of the blue, seeking gurus, were commonplace in the 1960s. What happened to Leslie, Pat, Susan, Catherine, Mary, Lynette, Sandra, and so many others could have happened to any trusting young woman who was on the road in those times, on a quest for enlightenment and a strong man to lead the way.